Hi, everybody. How are you? Welcome to the Wings of Dream podcast. So today is a very, very special day. We are from Eliezer African Foundation. We are in northern Uganda, Lira, and we have a special guest on this special episode. My name is Caroline, and I would love to introduce you to our special guest today. Would you tell them who you are, where you're from, what you're doing in this wonderful place?
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on this podcast. I'm so excited to be here with you, Carol, and to be able to share with your entire audience about some very important things to me. I'm Dr. Priscilla Chang, and I come from the United States, but I've been a missionary here in Uganda for nearly 7 years now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Have you learned some Lango?
I've learned a little bit of Lango.
How do you say hi?
I'm still learning along the way as well.
But can you greet?
We would say apoyoba, that's sort of the same word for thank you. And then we also say itianingo, which means how are you?
Wow. You've been using your time well. All right. Today we want to dive into a conversation about something that is wide, but we are going to find a way of talking and so that every person gets out something. And this something is trauma. You hear people saying trauma, mental health, what? So, and people are wondering, they don't know. Like recently, I was hearing someone was in a conversation, they were talking, and then out of nowhere, their friend busted. And they said, guy, you have trauma. And then out of nowhere, somebody was criticized, and out of nowhere, their attitude was all bad, and they're saying, man, you have some trauma that you have to fix. And some others, they stay in the house. Maybe they have the trauma of people looking at them. So since we have you here today, we would love to put a tick on that. What is trauma?
Yeah. So we have a lot of different definitions of trauma. There's a capital T trauma, big traumas, and then we also say little traumas, colloquially. But professionally within the field of mental health, and as a psychologist, I'm going to speak from that perspective a little bit.
Yeah.
In mental health, we think about traumas not as just things that we don't like or times when we feel hurt or neglected or where people aren't appreciative of us. Those aren't really traumas per se. From a mental health perspective, traumas occur when there is an unexpected, upsetting, distressing, out of control situation that has occurred that has then overwhelmed our capacity to cope. The key here is that overwhelming your capacity to cope. If you're not able to cope with it well, and you're seeing all of these different signs that the trauma is still continuing to have an impact or effect in your day-to-day life, and it's causing you to not be able to function in the ways that you normally would be able to carry on, that's what we would call a trauma. So you may feel hurt, you may feel disappointed, you may feel frustrated with other people, but that wouldn't qualify as a trauma per se. Traumas really do have to overwhelm our ability to cope, because most of us will experience times when we're not happy with the way that people interact with us, or when we feel hurt by something that somebody has said. But we're able to move on from that conversation and realize, hey, maybe what they said wasn't actually the truth about me. Right? And maybe those things I can just let slide off of my shoulder. I don't have to allow it to impact the very core of my identity or who I am.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that definition. I think everyone has put a tick. So while we continue, people are wondering, and I'm wondering too, are there types of trauma or it's just trauma? Would you love to clarify that?
Yeah, there are many types of trauma because there are many potentially traumatic events that happen in people's lives. Yeah. We experience many different kinds of traumas in our life. We have everything from physical abuse to sexual abuse, emotional and psychological abuse. We have neglect that we commonly see. We also see community violence, right? We see people in the community who are hurting one another, killing
True.
one another. We have domestic violence at home where there are relationships that are broken and are having really difficult time kind of coming together and are acting out violently, aggressively, manipulatively towards one another.
Yeah.
We have war traumas, we have natural disasters. All of those are potentially traumatic events, and all of them may cause different reactions. One that we don't commonly think about is medical trauma. So there are also traumas that can result from a medical injury or illness or disease through the medical procedures that have to happen that can cause a lot of anxiety about what is it that my body has to go through? Why is my body not doing what it's meant to do? There are a lot of things that can also cause medical traumas. And we don't oftentimes think about that kind of trauma, but it actually does impact a lot of people.
Oh, wow. That is very definite. So I believe someone out there has been helped. I've heard you in the definition talking about reactions, talking about symptoms, talking about trauma reactions.
Yeah.
So what are the common reactions of trauma or symptoms that one has to watch out for? And you're a counselor. There's some things that you've observed that people don't really take note of. So, what are those reactions, and how does someone identify those trauma reactions or symptoms
Yeah.
or responses? Would say.
So immediately after a potentially traumatic event, we often think about the 3 F's: fight, flight, or freeze. So the common reaction that's going to happen immediately after a potentially traumatic event is that they are going to want to fight back, right? And these aren't conscientious choices or decisions that a person is making. This is a reaction that they're having that is an instinct. So for some people, they might choose to fight back. This is exactly what happened in the story of Moses when Moses saw the Egyptian slave master abusing a Hebrew slave, right?
Yeah.
He immediately reacted, and his reaction was to murder this Egyptian slave owner. And we see that kind of fight in him. We also have situations where our natural reaction or our natural response is to flee, to flight, to leave the situation, to run away. And we see this a lot with King David, for instance.
Yeah.
Every time his enemies were coming after him, he was fleeing, hiding in caves, going to different places, running from place to place, trying to seek shelter. And you hear in his Psalms so many times he's crying out to God, help me, save me from my enemies, right? That flight, it's a natural reaction to get out of the situation. But for some, and tragically this happens often when it comes to sexual abuse, the reaction that our bodies have is freeze. And that is a reaction that is meant to protect us, but can oftentimes feel very challenging because we're like, hey body, why didn't you fight back? Why didn't you flee? And that's the expectation that many people have. Yeah. And they might even ask survivors of sexual abuse, why didn't you do something about it? Why didn't you scream? Why didn't you cry out? Yeah. But we see even in the account of like Bathsheba, who was raped by King David at the time, her response was to freeze. She didn't have a choice. She was in the power and control of the king at the time, right? So she didn't have another option to flee or to fight back. Both of those would have resulted in her likely having been subjected to death. So her natural response, her reaction was to protect herself, to survive, to live, and so she froze. And that's often the kind of response that we see in people who are experiencing sexual abuse in particular. So I just want to say, let's be mindful when we're talking to survivors, and that's really who we are. When we've experienced a potentially traumatic event and we've come out on the other end, we are survivors. We're not victims. We are survivors of the things that have happened to us. Be really mindful when you're talking to survivors to be cautious about thinking about those fight, flight, and freeze responses.
Yeah.
So after a while, after the immediate aftermath of the traumatic event or the potentially traumatic event, sometimes we have these lingering symptoms or these lingering signs. I think that's what you're trying to talk about.
Because as you're talking flight and fight and freezing, so I was wondering what are the day-to-day experiences that people have, because some people maybe they have nightmares, maybe anger, maybe some of them are like to be in control of things, people, situations. Would you love to expand it a bit to a person watching us?
Yeah, so similar to the natural instinctual responses that we have of fight, flight, and freeze, we have different categories of what we call trauma reactions or trauma responses. Those are what we would categorize in different ways as symptoms. So one of the main ones that you were talking about is this hypervigilance or hyperarousal, this sense that I have to always be alert that some danger might come to me. And so there's always this kind of amped up energy about them. They may be really hypervigilant about where everything is, make sure that I know exactly where my exit is so that I can get out of this space if I need to in a hurry. It might look like a startle response. If I hear something, even a car backfiring, then all of a sudden I'm jumping up out of my seat and people are looking at me like, what's wrong with him? Like, it was just a car, it's fine. Those kinds of hyper vigilant reactions or responses or hyperarousal, that's very common. We also have very commonly avoidance. Many times people who've experienced potentially traumatic events don't want to think about, talk about, have anything to do with the people or the places that remind them of what happened.
There's this phrase as you're talking that forget it, like you try to do everything to forget it, not to think about it as you're talking, because I hear that a lot.
Yes, so that's actually a third symptom, which is intrusive, distressing thoughts. These are recurrent, involuntary. We're not choosing to have these thoughts, but these thoughts are constantly coming to our mind. And people will say, just forget it. But it's not very easy to forget the traumatic event that happened to you, especially because one of the symptoms, one of the reactions and responses that we have is to remember. And it's not always bad to remember, because remembering can help prevent us from getting ourselves into a similar situation, right? There's a protective factor with the remembering, but the remembering becomes troublesome. It causes problems for us when it's happening in times that we don't want it to, when it's coming constantly and we're not able to find relief from it, and everything reminds us of the potentially traumatic event. Then we really see some immense distress among people who are just like, I just want to forget. And yet people are asking me about it, and I don't want to talk about it. I don't even want to be near the people or the places or the things that remind me about it.
Yeah, as you're talking about that, somebody maybe lost a mother, and then you just speak about it, and then out of nowhere they cry, and people fear asking people about those questions, that maybe it will bring back the flashbacks, maybe people who have been sexually abused physically, so people fear asking. As a counselor, because you deal with, what would you say about that? So that because maybe people are dealing with those situations, but then we are fearing to intervene.
Yeah. I think the beautiful thing about caring for your friend is that when you come from a place of care, not just curiosity, but actual care, where you're saying, hey, I'm here for you and I want to support you. I love you. And that's why I'm asking about you, because I'm sensing that something is off. Things are not okay with you. And I just want you to know that I'm here with you and I'm for you. And if you want to talk about it, fine. If you don't want to talk about it, that's okay. We can just sit here. If you just need to cry about it, I will sit here with you. I will hold your hand while you cry. I will just be here with you, right? Many different people will need different things. And it's okay for us to ask our friends, hey, what do you need right now? Do you need me to go get you a meal because you haven't eaten in a few days because you're so distressed? Do you need me to sit here with you and let you know that you're not alone in this? Do you need me to hear your story? What happened to you? If that's what you need, then I'm going to be here for you. right? But it's okay to ask the person, what do you need from me right now? That's
Okay.
the best way to manage or handle that situation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think somebody was helped, asked for you. So as we continue, trauma can be like an emotional wound. You're there, but you don't know something is eating you up.
Yeah.
Like a wound physically, if you look at it, it can be small, then it grows, it grows, it grows, it grows. So you find people, something is eating them up. You're seeing them, they can be pretending sometimes, but they're battling with a lot of things. It's a wound eating them, and wondering, some people who are new to it, what would you want to say about that as we continue?
Yeah. Trauma we can often equate to these emotional wounds. And like you're saying, sometimes they're a little bit hidden. It's not easy to identify them or to see them because people can walk around looking like they're happy and joyful. They put a smile on their face and they pretend like everything's okay.
Yeah.
And sometimes we miss out on some of these signs that we were just talking about. We don't notice when our friend's mood changes, when all of a sudden they're actually not feeling okay.
Yeah.
Or their thoughts are turning in different directions and they're not having the same positivity that they used to have. Now all of a sudden things seem like everything is negative and everything's going to be bad and nothing's going to work out. All of these kinds of wounds, as you're talking about, are easily overlooked. But the reality is that for many people, when they don't find hope and healing, when there isn't a support system in place or there isn't someone who's reaching out and saying, hey, I care about you,
Sure.
those wounds, like you're saying, will only grow. But they won't grow at the surface. They will usually grow underneath the surface and they will deepen, right?
True.
The pains will become even more intense. They will become even more difficult to run away from or get away from or find rest from. And so many times we won't even notice that someone is having these kinds of experiences until all of a sudden one day they're exploding. And you're like,
True.
hey, where is that coming from? And you didn't realize that right before that explosion of big emotions, there was actually something that triggered that to come up. Maybe they were reminded of the potentially traumatic event. We have lots of trauma triggers, trauma reminders, anniversary dates, smells, people, places that will remind us of the potentially traumatic event that can just set somebody off.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say that every person who is having explosions has trauma or is traumatized.
Thank you for clearing
Yeah.
that.
But it is to say that when we don't actually find the support, the courage to speak to someone about it, whether it is a counselor or a trusted friend or your pastor, about the wounds that you have and allow God to do his healing work in our lives, it's only going to create deeper seated pain. And that pain is going to sit with you for a long time and it feels awfully lonely and it's awfully challenging. And more we see people who are starting to then withdraw from other people. They don't feel as connected or as willing to share with people in their lives, even people who they used to trust and believe in. They're all of a sudden starting to withdraw and you're noticing some changes, and those are likely signs that the pain is overwhelming.
True.
And they're not able to cope with it. In the ways that they've tried, they haven't been able to find that healing that only comes from God.
Wow. As we're talking, my heart also feels pain, and I could feel for a lot of people, and those who are having this emotional wound. Maybe they're watching and they've come to realize right now, and some of them are already going through it.
Yeah.
Some of them they're there, they're not feeling supported. Mm-hmm. How would you advise as a counselor? How can these people dealing with trauma, psychological trauma, those traumas, how can someone overcome them and how can they be supported? I don't know if it's kind of one question, but how can this person be helped, taken out of that hole that is so deep, how can they be taken out? And they see this wonderful light, they're happy again, they're back to themselves. The child whom the parents said, you changed a lot, you're angry these days. How can they be taken out of that hole, and then they're into the light, being the people they're expected to be, maybe, if I would say.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because many people who have experienced potentially traumatic events and have trauma reactions and are struggling, feeling that deep pain, like we said before, don't really want to reach out. And so sometimes it's upon us who are their friends, their family, to notice and to ask, to say, hey, I've noticed some changes, and I'm not accusing you, I'm not blaming you, I just want to better understand and support you, right?
True.
I want you to know I'm here to listen, I'm here to care for you. You have done the same for me when I have been low, and I want to return the favor, right?
Yeah.
I think for those who are struggling and finding very little hope in life these days, I would say, man, there is so much that the Lord wants to give you, and He has promised you rest. He says in His word, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest.
Yeah.
And that rest is a rest that only God can give.
True.
We have to start first, going to Him, getting on our knees, praying to the Lord, asking Him to be our healer. The Bible says that God is Jehovah Rapha. He is the God who heals.
Yeah.
He doesn't only heal physical wounds. He also heals spiritual wounds and emotional wounds and psychological wounds as well. So when we go to Him, He is here to hear us, and He's here to answer our prayers. He says, when you seek me, you will find me when you seek me with your whole heart, right? So first, go to God. He should be always our first point of contact. Second, go to a trusted friend. Find somebody that you believe that you can really open up to and trust. You don't have to disclose everything that has happened or talk about the trauma that happened to you. What's important is that you share what your experience is now. How are you feeling now? How are you dealing with the things that have happened to you? What is your mood like? What have you noticed about how you're withdrawing from society, how you're hypervigilant and overactive in your thoughts when there are these intrusive ideas that are coming into your mind that you don't want them to? Share that with a friend. When we share with one another, God says that He is also present in those places, and that when we unburden one another, that's part of being the church for one another. That's what it means to be brothers and sisters in Christ, to share one another's burdens so that we can encourage one another, right? So it's our work, our job as brothers and sisters in Christ to encourage the one who is feeling hurt, who is feeling down, who is feeling like, this life is really difficult and really hard. We have hope because we have Jesus.
True. Thank you so much. I believe the person out there, the young people these days, they don't want to invest in physical relationships. They don't want to talk to people. They say, I'm an introvert, or I love being alone. So they go to their phones, says, maybe my phone can take away all my problems as long as I have my phone. And resonating with what you said, we really need to invest into friendships, because in those hard moments, the phone or your social media or the posts that you did cannot really help you, but a trusted friend, and also investing in God. So thank you for clarifying that. As we continue, there's something called comparison. As we continue, I would love to know: is comparison a part of trauma, or it's something we create for ourselves from our phones, from conversations, from different things? Because you can find somebody stressed over, maybe I saw my friend, they have posted and they're married and I'm not yet, and I'm even older. So, and even maybe a youth there is at the university. They come from a humble background. They cannot be like a person of a rich, they cannot be like the child of a rich person. They're better off, that's the reality. so you can't change it. So you find people are stressed. As they say these days, I'm stressed, I'm stressed. So how can we go about that as we are talking about trauma?
Yeah, comparison really does kill our joy. It just takes away the pleasure and delight that God desires for us to have in life, right? It is a distortion of what is meant to be for us connections in community. God created for us this fellowship, this connecting one to another. It isn't about comparing one to another, because your story is different from my story, and each of our stories matter. Each of our stories is unique and special, and to God, they are so valuable and so important. Even though your story is different from mine, and my story will never be your story, right? When we compare one to another, what we're saying is, God, you didn't do me right. Right? Why didn't I look like that person? Why didn't you give me that thing? Why didn't I have parents like that one? Why am I in this situation? And in effect, we're saying to God, hey, you got it wrong. Right?
Yeah.
And do we really mean to say that to God? Do we really intend to say, hey, God, you got it wrong? Can God ever get it wrong?
No, he can't.
No, he can't, right? So when we learn to embrace our story, and rather than comparing ourselves up or comparing ourselves down, saying, hey, look, I'm better than so-and-so, or, oh, man, like, they are not as good as me, you know? Like, I think that the key here is that when you want to compare yourself to your former self. Look at, where have I come from, and where is God taking me next? Where am I now? Where is he taking me next? Rather than comparing yourself one to another, because my story won't be your story, and my story can never look like your story, nor would I want it to, right? Why would I want to be like you? God made you, you, and he made me, me. So when we recognize that we are each fearfully and wonderfully made in his image, but uniquely, divinely created, gifted in different ways, talented in different ways, that allows us then to be able to have that restored joy. And I can see where I've come from and where God is taking me, and that is exciting and joyful too.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Priscilla. Somebody watching us as we are winding up would love to encourage you that there is light at the end of that tunnel. So
Yes, there is.
keep doing what you're supposed to do, as we have heard from our counselor today. Don't forget to go to this website, to this YouTube channel. Go and subscribe, go and comment, go and share, so that you help a person out there. Be that trusted friend. From all of us, would say bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.